So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and welcome you all to the virtual reading group. Today we are continuing with our reading of Hannah Arendt's posthumous collection, edited by Jerome Cohn, of The Promise of Politics. One of the really interesting books of Hannah Arendt's. It's based on a number of studies that she did, none of which I think were published, at least in their current form, in the 1950s, the mid 1950s, around her work on a book on Marx that was going to be called The Modern Challenge to Tradition. We've been reading a number of sections of this book on Montesquieu, on Marx, on Hegel, on Socrates, and the tradition of political thought. And in reading about the tradition of political thought, we have also talked about the end of political thought and Arendt, an end of the tradition of political thought. And that can mean a couple of things, as you can imagine. The word end can mean the goal or the aspiration. And so on one level, the end of the tradition is what the tradition aims for, what its goal is. On another level, the end or aim of the tradition is where it ends. And she's going to make an argument that the tradition of political thought has a beginning and an end. And I just want to say, before I get into that as with so much about Arendt, one of the things so many of us love about her, or find at least provocative and meaningful about her, is her willingness to make distinctions, right? To define terms. This is what politics is, and we're going to get there. This is what conservatism is, or this is what liberalism is. And she wants to say, look, if we're going to have meaningful conversations, we got to offer definitions. Obviously, the definitions are going to be approximate. You can never give a full definition of something like politics. In the same way, you can't give a full account of the tradition of political thinking. It would be folly. There is so many political thinkers, so many nuances in each political thinker. And so, I just want to put out there, she's telling a story. She is profoundly aware that this story is partial and that there are other ways to tell it. So in this story of the political tradition, it's going to begin with Plato and it's going to end with Marx, okay? She knows that she could read Plato differently than she does. She could read Plato and provide and present him not as a thinker of rule and of anti-politics, but she could find in Plato resources and quotes and texts to read him as a thinker of politics in her term. Same with Aristotle, and same with all the thinkers that she's going to read in the tradition. Similarly, she could read Marx in a much more political way, but she doesn't. And why? Well, she's telling a story, and it's a story that, as with the kind of rigorous distinctions and definitions that she wants to make in her terminology, this story is going to tell us what she thinks is the mainstream story of modern political thinking, or of all political thinking from Plato to the present. And so how does the story go? Well, we've talked a little bit about it, but what's the beginning and what's the end? There are two beginnings in Arendt's telling of the tradition, and they are both a response to an earlier beginning, which she calls politics. And that beginning is the Greek polis, this weird and amazing thing that emerged in Greece in the 6th through the 4th century BC, where citizens came together, picked by lot, gathered in the public sphere, and engaged in the activity of self-government. And this political activity of politics came to a crisis with the trial and the death of Socrates. And it did so because what you saw was the politics, the people, be unwilling to accept the kind of speaking and persuasion of one of its members, namely Socrates, and puts him to death. And for Arendt, the reaction to this by Plato is a complete suspicion and contempt for politics and for the idea of persuasion and speech. He no longer believed that the political persuasion that happened in the marketplace or happened in the polis was adequate to pursue truth and good government. And so Plato puts up against politics the idea of philosophy, so that politics is now for Plato a kind of degraded form of opinion, the opinion of the many, where people go and follow whatever they feel like. And philosophy is the art of thinking, in which a philosopher acquires the truth and then must implement it in the polis. Against Plato, right, there's another beginning in Aristotle. And Aristotle, she waffles on at times, but in thinking about Aristotle is another beginning. She says that Aristotle defines man as the zoon politikon, the animal, the zoon, who is political, and he's also the man who has speech, the zoon echen logon, the animal who has the capacity to speak, logos. And for Arendt, taking these two definitions together, she says that what Aristotle understood contra Plato is that man is only fully man if he is in the polis, if he is politikos, a member of the polis. And thus, Aristotle counter Plato. For Plato, the politics, the life of the polis and the politics is seen with contempt, whereas Aristotle says in some way it is the life of speaking and acting together in the polis that makes us man. The tradition of political thinking, she says, largely goes back to Plato, not Aristotle. And it's defined by the Platonic, what she calls contempt for politics. She says that for Plato and for all thinkers in the tradition post-Plato, and again, this is an overstatement, but it's one that she thinks is the majority feeling, politics is a necessary evil. What does she mean by that? She means that we only need politics because we have to do two things. One, we have to provide for our biological needs. We humans are needy creatures. We need food, shelter, procreation, other things like that in order to exist. And in order to organize that, we need politics. So that politics for Plato is simply a technical activity that provides for our biological necessity. It's an activity of a group of technocrats, philosophers, who think about what we need, come up with a 5-year plan, if you want to think of it in Marxian terms, and implement it. That's the first thing, reason that politics is a necessary evil. We don't like all this stuff about the hoi polloi and talking to people and having to pass elections and elect people. That's not very good. It's an evil, but it's necessary evil. The other reason that politics is a necessary evil is we need to create safety or security. We need to create a world in which those of us who are philosophers like Plato can philosophize safely. And so we need to create a world that makes the world, which is dangerous and in Hobbesian language, nasty, brutish, and short. We need to make that safe for philosophy to create. And so politics is a necessary evil to create a sort of post-political situation of safety. The whole point of politics in the Platonic school is to create um, to free those who are the thinkers and who want to be free from political duty. This is skole, school. The word, our word school comes from this Greek word skole, which means leisure, but not leisure in the sense of laying back and enjoying yourself, but having the freedom from political duty in order to philosophize. And so to learn, that's what school is. The people who go to school are the elite, and the elite are those who don't have to engage in the combat around necessities in the polis. This Platonic tradition, she says, goes throughout the whole West. So the Christians took this Platonic tradition and embraced this contempt for the public. So she quotes for Tertullian here, quote, to us, nothing is more alien than public affairs. This is on page 83 and 84, or 84, I'm sorry. Luther says that Christians wohnen fern voneinander, live far from one another. They're individuals. The true Christian idea is simply to think about God. It's not to engage in politics. Christians don't need a lot of other people. James Madison says in the United States that government is a necessary evil, and it's only necessary because men are not angels. And if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. There's no good in government. It's just there to protect us, provide for our necessities, and allow us then to be free in our private lives. And in this contempt for politics, for Arendt, there's a degradation of politics, and thus a degradation of the idea of the many, of the life of the many versus the life of singular. And here you get to really, I think, begin to see what Arendt is after. She says that the main contrast between political philosophy and politics is the contrast between those who believe that human life is to be lived in the singular, namely the philosophers, versus those who believe that human life is to be lived among the many, living together. The one thinker in the tradition that she says understood this was Cicero. And on 86, she says that Cicero understood that to be devoted to knowledge, to be a philosopher, is to be miserable. And man needs company, needs others to talk to and to teach. But she says this Ciceronian insight, the Roman insight, has been vanquished, and the Greek idea of the politics as a necessary evil has triumphed. And the end of this, in the sense that the culmination of this view of the tradition, is in Karl Marx. Again, she has great love and respect for Marx as a thinker, but she sees him in the tradition of Plato, someone else she has great love and respect for. This is not in any way a condemnation of Marx, but what she says is that Marx did two things that show him to be the end of the tradition in which politics is degraded. The first is he names all laws, all positive laws, ideologies, pretexts for the exercise of rule. So you all heard the phrase, I assume, something along this phrase of law is just the rule of the powerful. Laws are made by the powerful to protect the powerful. And so for Marx, law is simply an ideology. It's an ideological pretext for the powerful to impose their rule. And so for him, the essence of communism as a political matter is the destruction of all law. you need to get rid of laws, because laws simply are the powerful, are the way that the powerful control the oppressed. And he replaces law, which is a stabilizing factor. So Arendt's idea of law as a political factor is that you create law, and in creating law, you create a public world with rules and boundaries in which people can then appear and act under, under conditions of here's what's allowed and here's what's not allowed. And Marx replaces those ideas of law as a stabilizing factor with the idea of law as a history, as a science of history, or a movement. So instead of laws, which are just, the community's laws now become the law of history, the law of the rise of the proletariat. And for Marx, these laws are not ever stable. They are constantly in motion, because any stability is an ideological reification. An ideological is one moment where some group of people in power has taken power and poses those laws. And so, this is a similarity between Marx and totalitarianism. The essence of totalitarianism, or one of the essences of totalitarianism for Arendt, is that it replaces laws with movements of history, with either socialist laws of the development of history or racist laws of the development of superior classes. And that the whole point of this is that these movements have to constantly undo any stabilizing factors. And so they are actually anti-law, but they are lawful in the sense that they follow these laws of nature, namely racist laws, or laws of history, communism laws. So the first political implication of Marx in this way is that he's anti-law in the sense of stabilizing law. But on the other side, he's not against the state. And so he holds on to the state. And the particular way in which he holds on to the state is as a dictatorship of the proletariat. And so for Arendt, he has four ideas of rule, right? There's rulership of masters over the slaves, rulerships of the nobles over the serfs, rulership of the bourgeoisie over the workers, and then eventually the rulership of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie and everyone else. All of these models of rule are on the models of slavery. And what they all presume is that in every state, there's going to be those who know and those who don't know. There's going to be the philosophers and there's going to be everyone else. And for Marx, the difference, and what makes communism different and more just, is that those who know and those who rule on knowledge are the proletariat, not the bourgeoisie or the masters or anyone else. And so what she says is, and this is on page 91, and it's, I think, a really important formulation at the very bottom of 91, at the bottom of the long paragraph. She says, in other words, action becomes mere execution, which is determined by somebody who knows and therefore does not himself act. Politics becomes execution of knowledge. And if you think of, Stalin, right, and the 5-year plan as sort of the classic Lenin-Stalinist idea, the point is that action is replaced by execution. We simply come up with a plan, those of us who are scientists and know, and we execute that plan. We don't have the freedom of political action. And so this brings us back to her claim that Marx, in the end, is a political philosopher. He's part of the tradition. And as part of the tradition, he's actually part of the Platonic tradition of contempt for politics and the replacement of politics by a philosopher king. The difference is that Marx's philosopher king is not Plato. It is the proletariat who studies natural laws of economic development. And these sort of social scientists, Marxist, Leninist scientists, dialectical scientists, become, in Arendt's reading, the culmination of the philosopher king in the political tradition. This essay leads into the longer, almost booklet, which Arendt calls Introduction to Politics, which we're going to read for the next few weeks. And it goes from page 93 to 204. So, we're talking about 111 pages or so. This is a draft of a book that she never published. And it begins introduction into politics, right? Into politics. What does that mean? That's a very important point. It's not to politics, but into. Politics is something you jump into. It's going to be a realm, a world, a polis. And she begins with this question, what is politics? And against the tradition of political thinking, which says that politics is about the execution of ideas and a contempt for the many, she says that politics is based on the fact of human plurality. It's based on the fact that there are many of us and that those of us are different. We're not the same. And so politics, she says, deals with the coexistence and association of different men. Men organize themselves politically according to certain essential commonalities found within or abstracted from an absolute chaos of differences. And the problem here is that not only has philosophy had a contempt for politics because it sees politics as chaotic, but the structure of politics, largely under the guise of philosophy, under the guidance of philosophy, has continued to see rulership as the essence of politics, and thus the family as the model for politics, whether it's the father's patriarchal authority over the family, or the master over the slave, or the noble over the serf, or the bourgeoisie over the workers, or in Marx, the proletariat over everyone else. There's a sense of rulership by which a dominant ruler controls everybody else in a kind of demand that everyone follow a common path or truth. And she says, this is, I love this line on page 94, families are founded as shelters and mighty fortresses in an inhospitable alien world into which we want to introduce kinship. So families are shelters and mighty fortresses against others, against difference. And when family becomes the model for politics, she says, this desire leads to the fundamental perversion of politics because it abolishes the basic equality of plurality, or rather forfeits it by introducing the concept of kinship. So what she wants to say here is that there are two good reasons why philosophy can't really do politics. The first is that philosophy considers human nature, man, but man himself, she says, is not political. Man is apolitical. Politics is not part of human nature. It's part of what arises and happens when a bunch of different humans jump into the political world, into a polis that is secured and formed by laws which provide stability and allow people to interact in this in-between world. And so politics is what happens in between different men. It's not what men are in themselves. And the second is that because of the monotheistic conception of God, we think of men as singular, not as plural. The Marxian solution to this, as we've talked about, is to replace politics with philosophy, and for Marx specifically with history, with the history of the rise of dialectics and eventually the coming to rule of the proletariat. Against this, she wants to say that the truly free space of politics is one that needs to be free from history, free from all knowledge. To just bring this into the contemporary world and things that I've talked about a lot, because I'm working on this as a project. Politics stands against the rule of experts. That doesn't, and against the rule of philosophers. That doesn't mean philosophers and experts aren't important or are bad, not at all. It just means that philosophers and experts, in Arendt's understanding, make a claim to the right to rule out of a contempt for politics, and that is what she sees as dangerous. So in this essay, Introduction to Politics, which we're going to be reading for the next few weeks, this is the idea she's going to explore of how we enter into the free space of politics and what that might mean. All right, so I'll end there and open it up for questions for those who are new. You can ask questions in two ways. One in the chat, although more reliable is to raise your hand because I don't always get a chance to read the chat. There's a lot in it. You can go to the participants button, click on that, and then next to your name, choose the raise hand function and raise your hand. All right, so we'll start on the raised hands, and James Kyberd. Hi, James.
Roger, you look great today.
Oh, thank you.
I had a lot of fun with this chapter. I read it maybe 6 or 7 times, and probably because I saw Long Way Home, the piece about Bob Dylan that Scorsese did. Richard Rorty, remember him? Came to visit me in the middle of the night, and he said, when you read it again, open yourself up, baby. And as I looked at the top of the VRG website, there's this hot picture of Hannah Arendt with beautiful hands and a cigarette. So I entered this bar room, and Hannah Arendt was playing me as a pinball on the pinball machine. This chapter went pinballing all over the place. I was the hoi polloi. Do you know what I'm saying?
I'm trying.
From Aristotle to Plato to Socrates to Cicero to Montesquieu to Hegel to Marx, and she winds up, and I'm thinking, okay, philosophy up in the sky, politics down on the earth pretty low, and I wind up, the last sentence was that action or praxis contrary to the whole tradition was so far from being opposite of thought that it was the true and real vehicle of thought, and that politics, far from being infinitely beneath the dignity of philosophy, was the only activity that was inherently philosophical. And at that point, my ball dropped into the machine, and she chuckled and laughed and took a drag on her cigarette and gave it a little hip shot. What a trip this chapter was. It had everything in it. What am I going to do with this? Is my question to myself. I'm an actor. I'm an artist, a painter. I am an ambassador for UNICEF. I live in the body-mind, not in the mind-body. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I open myself up and glue this into my life, or make it lubricate my life and my creativity, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no.
Any suggestion? And if anybody out there has any suggestions, please send them to me. I'll humbly listen. I feel like I'm swimming over my head, and I don't mind drowning, but let me know. That's it.
Thanks, James. Can you just mute? Yeah. So I'll let other people respond as well. I'll say a little bit quickly. I think what I take to be the core of your question is how do we swim in this ocean? And I think the answer from her point of view is along the lines of we embrace difference, we embrace plurality, we check, we body check or hip check the very profound desire that we all have as children of this tradition to subdue contrary opinions and claim they are wrong. Her view is you don't claim they're wrong, you claim that you disagree with them and you argue with them and you try and persuade people. And if you lose, that's part of politics, right? We now live at a time in which whatever political persuasion people are, losing is considered, a disaster, a moral disaster, a political disaster, is everything. And from Arendt's point of view, that is the victory of the tradition of politics that sees politics as a family or sees politics as a philosophical project that seeks to impose truth over a kind of chaotic political hoi polloi evil. And so if there's one takeaway from a current political idea, and it's not an easy one, and so I'm not trying to say, oh, this is going to be easy. I think it's incredibly difficult and dangerous. It's that we have to be more willing to engage in a politics with no truth, in a politics of real contention and disagreement, and accept that and come to enjoy it and embrace it. So does anyone else want to respond to James's question?
I just want to say that sounds like mother's milk to me, Roger. I love it. It's delicious.
I'm glad. Does anyone else want to respond to James's question?
May I jump in?
Yeah, I heard someone, but I can barely hear you. Speak up.
It's Clara from Colombia.
Hi, Clara.
How are you? I just want to say that you were great in your exposition. Great. And also in your answer.
Thank you,
Roger.
I appreciate it. Anyone else? Jack, I heard you laughing before. Did you want to jump in or not? No? All right, Jeff, you're up.
Yeah, I can.
There we go. Very quickly, I did not intend to speak. I was laughing because I love the way in which James presented his thinking. In this group, we often are very logical and I don't know how to describe it, but this dream or whatever it was that he was, this hallucination through which he expressed his feelings, I thought was just wonderful. So I have some ideas of my own. I have my hand raised for later, but thank you for the opportunity to remark on what James said.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I've been having some interesting conversations with Bill T. Jones, some of you, outside of this. And, a lot of it's been about what's the use of this kind of philosophizing for the world. And I think it's really important for us to not, to take our end seriously. That's what we're trying to do, but to not put up barriers. And so I also want to say thank you to James for the formulation.
I just want to say real quick, what this process is doing for me is opening spaces in my thinking, opening spaces in my experience and my sensual relationship with the world. I find myself saying, wait a second, listen to that plant that I'm gardening or that painting or that person, and let it open me up and engage me more than me engaging it. It's a wild ass gift.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. I think you're right. Jeff, you're up.
I think I can use James's concern to introduce mine, which is about the beginning of introduction into politics. But I think we're getting this whole book has been pretty big, I think. But she's so casual about how she upends the way that we think about things. You know, and so in the earlier part in Socrates and in the essay that we read for today, uh, if you do anything in philosophy, then you just realize how she's just completely upended everything and really included Marx into that mix. But I want to get to my question because I've got a couple of passages to read here. So in Introduction into Politics, she spends about a page on it, and the sentence I just chose is the one before the one Roger read. But in practical political terms, the family acquires its deep-rooted importance from the fact that the world is organized in such a way that there is no place within it for the individual, and that means for anyone who is different. Well, there's a lot that comes out of this in the years following this essay. And then the next page, it's actually kind of buried in there, but I think it's almost as big here. It's difficult to comprehend that there is a realm in which we can be truly free. That is, and this is the weird part, neither driven by ourselves, nor dependent on the givens of material existence. Well, the second part's not too amazing.
Jeff, did you get cut off?
Sorry. How does she think she can get away with this? It's like she's basically saying the family is sort of the model for a lot of bad things that have happened in the name of uniformity, right? And then for freedom, she's like saying, well, to be freedom is not, that again, not driven by ourselves. And I remember that's not just a one-off. I mean, I've seen that in bits and other parts of her writing.
Yeah.
So just how does she? This is like a complete 180 on these two very deep issues.
So thank you, Jeff. On the family question, I mean, you know, she's reading the family as a model for politics. You know, so those of you who've read John Locke, you know, just to take one example, you know, he's responding to a long tradition of political thinking that says that, you know, politics begins with Adam as the first patriarch, and you know, all politics is about the sort of patriarchal rule of a household. And this model of the family has been a sort of model of politics, you know, for thousands of years. And what she's doing, I think, although it's never said explicitly here, is compressing that political history with the history of political thought from Plato to Marx, saying that the elevation of rulership over and against action is part and parcel of the continued dominance of the family model in politics, and that what this model of politics does is it seeks to homogenize or unify politics. You know, we in the United States often talk about e pluribus unum, out of many one, right? Danielle Allen, in a piece I think I cited in the Amor Mundi that came out yesterday, and I'll come out again on Sunday, you know, says, yeah, out of many one, but don't focus too much on the one, focus on the many. And the danger is when we focus too much on the one. And so she's just pushing that forward. The other part, which I think is really important, the sentence on 95 that you cited, it is so difficult to comprehend that there's a realm in which we can be truly free, that is neither driven by ourselves nor dependent on the givens of material existence. So when she says not driven by ourselves, she means that freedom is not a quality of me as an individual. To be free doesn't mean for me to go in the woods and commune with God or meditate. You know, nothing wrong with doing that, right? In fact, she may say that that may be a condition for us to then enter into the public world and be free. In order to be free, you have to have a self that you can then bring into the world with your unique perspectives, and then, you know, play with others. And so, you know, that's why you need a private sphere in her world to become a self. And that could be due with philosophy or other things. But man himself is apolitical. And freedom is something that happens in politics. And so freedom and politics both don't come out of anything in ourselves. They come out of our interactions with others, and it's in between. And that's the insight that she's pushing here. Okay.
May I add something short?
Yes.
That freedom, I would also say that for Arendt, freedom is an experience. And that I love that sense. It's an experience. You have to experience freedom. It's not a conceptual or an idea.
That's exactly right. It is an experience, but it's an experience of being with others in the political sphere. And thus it's always a space. She'll actually say at the end of On Revolution, it's a spatial experience. And that's an important caveat. It's an experience that happens in spaces. Here she calls it the space of politics on page 95. In On Revolution, she's going to call it spaces of freedom. And I think the spatial aspect of Arendt, you know, it's not something that has been, I think, fully enough commented on, but but I think it's what Clara said, it's an experience that happens in certain spaces. And the spaces are not geometrical spaces, they're political spaces. The polis is the quintessential space of freedom, although there are others as well.
That actually helps a lot on the freedom, but I just wanted, did she get any blowback on the family part in particular? And how did she deal with it?
I'm not sure, Jeff. I don't, you know, I don't think the family, you had the family politics in the 1950s. Oh, you did, but they weren't as political today. I don't think she was really talking about, protect the family politics here. She's a big fan of the private sphere. And in fact, I'll reverse this on you a little bit. In a number of her more controversial essays, in fact, some of her most controversial essays, she will defend the right of families to teach their kids whatever they want, including racist and sexist and homophobic and anti-Semitic things. She thinks that's part of what each private family has the right to do. What she says is that when those kids or adults enter the public sphere, they have to act as citizens and thus treat everyone equally. But that doesn't mean they have to do that in private. And so she actually is a strong defender of the exclusivity of the family in that sense, just not as a political model.
Roger, can I say something?
Yeah.
I keep thinking about her Eichmann book and her support of ridding the earth of Eichmann as a kind of limit of who can be conversed with. And,
yeah.
And it's a problem for me today to think in terms of extremists, white nationalists and so on, of how to have, it's really it doesn't come easily to me to have a conversation with some members of the American society who are behaving in a certain way and uttering certain things. And I was interested in what you say about the family and the private sphere and raising your own kids and so on. the problem, though, is that the inculcation of certain values creates members of the plurality with whom it's really hard to have a conversation from my perhaps prejudicial point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. You know, two good points in there. The first about Eichmann. You know, Arendt's decision that Eichmann should be banished from the earth is not because of his opinions, but because of what he did. And she says, you know, we can reconcile with a lot, but we can't reconcile with someone who took action to exterminate an entire group of people from the face of the earth. And that was what, you know, from her point of view, made Eichmann someone who could not be reintegrated into the plurality of the world, because he sought to destroy that plurality. You know, you're then analogizing that to sort of political extremists today. You know, is I think I understand it. You know, there's a difference between opinion, right, and action. And there's certainly a difference between you know, not letting people into a country, to take one example, and trying to exterminate an entire race or religion. So you know, Arendt, I mean, there are certain fine lines. I don't think that reaches one yet, but you know, she says as long as it's a matter of opinion and people are arguing about it, you know, you can find it dangerous and you can reject it, but it's not something that should be wiped off the face of the earth until it becomes a real fundamental attack on plurality. You know, if you think that's what's happening, then you raise that question.
Seems like a slippery slope between,
well, it may be
actions and
it may be, but I mean, I think, you know, you're not seeing. I mean, again, there are things that come close to genocide. You know, I don't know if, you know, Mitch McConnell is a genocideer. I mean, he's got his own issues. But we can. I mean, if you want to make that case, we can make it. But let's wait a second. Inji, you're up.
Sorry. So as you mentioned, Arendt makes distinctions in order to facilitate discussions. But in reality, public, private, or action thinking are not always clearly separate. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think Arendt thought this distinction should be real? Or is she just using these distinctions to talk about the concepts better? If she thought this distinction should be real, what do you think of this other reality that the public, private, or action thinking are not always separate? Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Inji. It's a great question. You know, so Arendt, you know, makes these distinctions throughout her writing. Inji talked about two: public, private, action thinking. And, you know, she's aware, and we should always be aware, that these distinctions are never clearly, you know, demarcated. There's always a fuzzy middle. You know, you know, with public, private, you know, I think one of the places where you see the fuzzy middle the best is in schools. And that's where Arendt, you know, probably gets into more trouble than any other place in all of her writing. Are schools public? Are they social, or are they private? And Arendt, you know, goes back and forth on this, to be honest with you. In her essay on crisis in education, she'll talk about how in America schools are public. In her essay, Reflections on Little Rock, she'll say that the schools are social and private. And as a result, in those two different essays, she comes out in different places. Now, I'm not saying she's inconsistent. I think she has reasons in both those essays to focus on the private or the social or the public elements of education. But there's no doubt that something like education is in some ways private, as she says, because there's nothing more private, she says, in a free society than how a parent chooses to educate their children. And if we require parents to send their kids to school, parents should have that right of privacy to determine the kind of school their kids are going to go to. At the same point, schools are not just private, they're also social, where people become socialized into a common American idea. And thus, in socialization, there's a kind of right of discrimination. And so you should be able to discriminate which schools you go to. And then on the other hand, and this is the argument she makes in Christ in Education, the American schools are different from schools in other countries because they also are the ways in which the factories in which we create new model American citizens on a public basis. And thus they have to teach people how to act as public citizens. And thus they must treat people equally and not be, simply private or social discriminatory bodies. And so, I think in her writing on schools, you see the complexity of trying to make these distinctions. So the question, Angie, is, does that mean the distinctions don't matter? Does that mean we should say, well, like, because we can't really make these cut and dry distinctions, they're not helpful? I think she thinks they're helpful because she says, if you're going to think through an issue like voluntary segregation, you have to think it through principled, and you have to understand that if you try and solve one problem, equality, you're going to run into another problem, freedom. And so she says, the distinctions don't decide the matter, right? There's no claim ever that just because schools have a private focus, therefore it decides the matter that we should allow for voluntary segregation. That's not her argument at all. She says you just have to be aware that there are costs of everything. There's costs of segregation and there's costs of forced integration. And these different, distinctions, public, private, social, help us understand the costs. Similarly with action and thinking, there's obviously good reasons to consult and think about experts in politics. If we're dealing with the COVID virus, we want to know what the best epidemiologists and, Mr. Fauci say about it. That's thinking, right? And it's an important part of any kind of political action. Her problem is not that. Her problem is that when we then say, well, because, the epidemiologists know how diseases spread, we should let them decide whether we should open the schools or not. And she says, that's not a scientific question. That's a question of politics. That's a question of action. That's a question where there are no experts. The experts can tell you how many kids might get sick if you open the schools. But whether that's a cost we're willing to bear or not is not an expert question. That's a political question. And she wants to keep that separate. And so she wants to say it's important for us to understand the difference between thinking and action so that we don't, let one dominate over the other in ways that it shouldn't. So again, I don't think ever these distinctions are supposed to be absolute. I don't think they're supposed to decide the matter, but they are supposed to help sharpen our thinking. And that's why I think for her, they're useful and I find them useful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. It's very helpful.
Thank you, Angie. It was a great question. Jack, you're up now.
Thank you, Roger. Before I begin, I just want to say that in response to something that Clara said, there is one of my favorite modern klezmer groups has a song which I recommend to everybody called "Freedom is a Verb," and you can find that by just looking for it on YouTube. Just put in "Freedom is a Verb" and you'll be able to see and hear this wonderful song. I really want to enter here because I see this as an opportunity for me finally to defend Karl Marx. So I read the End of the Tradition a little bit differently. And that's because I read Marx differently. So Marx, I think she's very clear about how Marx has defined the levels of rule, so to speak, the historical progression of the levels of rule from slave to bourgeois to proletarian rule. And Marx is no endorser of rule. He just thinks that that's the natural evolution of human society, starting from slavery, as different things happened, different things evolved that caused different people to rule in different ways. And the final stage is not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but rather a stage that wipes that away as well. So, and I think that's really important because Hannah Arendt is looking backwards from the middle of the 20th century, in which Marx's ideas have been carried through politically by people who obviously did not intend for the dictatorship of the proletariat to end. And so, and in fact, that produced totalitarian regimes. And we've seen a couple of them calling themselves Marxist or basing themselves on Marxist ideas that clearly are not what Marx had thought would happen, okay? So he tried to make a prediction of the future. Hannah Arendt looks backward and in a sense actually blames it on him, blames his future on him. But all that Marx actually claimed, and I think this is really very important because it's part of the conversation we're having here, is that it was always wrong to depend first on thought for action, that action itself needs to be in consonance as much as possible with with change that is evolving. He was in certain ways a Darwinian, and then he thought that the society would develop in the same way that that biology developed, and that we were all part of that ongoing stream. I think that's not a far-fetched idea, and I think there's a way of even viewing Hannah Arendt's thinking in that context, because what she is seeking is what she defines as freedom, which is a plural society where plurality is actually the basis of the politics, and she goes back all the way back to the polis for that. That she wants to eliminate the imposition of rule by any interest, by any special interest, or any minority, or any or even experts, or whatever it is, any group that doesn't take the entire society into consideration. And the idea that what I see here in her writing as the human family, right, is a family in which is neither patriarchal nor matriarchal, but rather communal. And I think she sees the end of oppression in the same way that Marx did, by the establishment of an open community.
Okay. So thanks, Jack. You know, again, I don't read this as a critique of Marx per se, and I don't think she meant it as a critique of Marx in the sense of he's responsible for, as you were saying, social, Stalinism or other things. Um, there's ways in which I think there's two levels on which you can read this, at least, maybe more. So one is simply the political theory level that I think is the most direct account going on here, which is the argument that as a matter of political theory, Marx stands within the tradition of political rule, not outside it, and that he is the end of it, insofar as, I mean, at least at this point, the end of it. There may be another end of it after, but he represents the political idea of rule that we live under today, more or less, which is not master of slaves or serfs or of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat, but that we are governed increasingly by these kind of movements, this kind of formulas or procedures or histories or sciences, what you call a stream of history, or a natural evolution. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, yes, is supposed to wither away. But for Arendt, it doesn't wither away into freedom. Even in Marx, it withers away into administration. And so to the extent that even in Marx's thinking, the ultimate goal of the political structure is administration, is for her further evidence, an account of the fact that Marx shares this contempt of politics that defines the tradition from Plato up through Marx. The other side of what you're saying about whether he has been betrayed by his political friends, whether it's Lenin or Mao or whoever, I think that's a much, I think Arendt's, I think her view on it is yes and no, right? Yes, of course, Marx, never said go and kill a couple million kulaks, he just, he didn't say that, and unclear what he would have said. Unlikely he would have. And yet, when she quotes Lenin on page 89, where Lenin says, "We do not deny the possibility of excesses on the part of individual persons, but no special machine of repression is needed for this. This will be done as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, parts two people who are fighting or interferes to prevent a woman from being assaulted." That the excesses will wither away and we'll just have a kind of administration. I don't think she thinks that's inconsistent with Marxism, which doesn't mean that Marx would have engaged in the kind of totalitarian horrors that Stalin and Lenin did. So, I don't think this is a condemnation of Marx. I think it's simply a reading of Marx that sees him within a long tradition that begins with Plato, but that has very much impacted our current politics.
Well, just let me, I don't want to take up a lot of time with this, but the way in which I perceive a certain kind of liberal capitalist in modern terms is a capitalist person who believes in capitalism and who is himself a capitalist, who perceives the possibility of revolt by the, I'm going to call it now the proletariat, but we don't really use that language very much anymore, and who therefore designs ways to mollify the proletariat to prevent revolt, to prevent rebellion. And I think that this I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here because there's so many things that you said. I'm concerned, right? Here's my concern. My concern is that there's much to be learned from Marx about the way in which the world works. But once it is stated, it itself changes things. That is, Marx, just by doing the analysis that he did, actually changed the way things were going to work. And the idea that we are in the process of evolution, a social evolution, is I think real, whether we think so or not. And that we can't say exactly where we're headed because we don't know where we're headed. But Marx was one of those people who projected a communitarian result. And in a way, I think so does Arendt. Yeah. That's what I was trying to say.
Well, I think we're not going to belabor this too much, but the thing that Marx saw that from Arendt's point of view really changed the world was to take the Hegelian insight that history is what sort of dominates, and that everything is history, everything is in the stream of consciousness, and make that into the political claim that there are no political truths, right? There are no political limits, and that everything can be remade and changed in the name of carrying out the laws of history. And that attack on law, right, which is a big part of Arendt's reading of Marx, that there's no such thing as law in the old sense of stable legal rules, but that all laws are now laws of history, laws of nature, laws of development, laws of progress, creates a politics without limit. And it's a politics without limit that is what makes movements politically viable in the totalitarian sense. And so, again, this is not blaming Marx, right? First of all, Hegel did it before Marx. It's simply saying that an unintended consequence of the Marxian attack on limits and law as limits has been to make the world safe for totalitarianism and totalitarian thinking. It's not a critique of Marx.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. That point I do not disagree with. I think that is correct.
Yeah. Spiros, you're up.
Yes, Spiros is the correct one.
Spiros, I apologize.
Yes, okay. And Spiros, okay.
Spiros, no, I'll go with it.
But Spiros is the real pronunciation of my name. Okay. If you don't mind, Roger, I would like to go back to the meaning of tradition, okay, because I'm, as you know, I'm professor of political philosophy, and I would like to know how we construct the canon. You know, it's a technical question for us. The most of the times, how do we can't build the canon or the tradition? So in the beginning, we have Plato and Aristotle, okay, but in what sense? I'm wondering. In my opinion, Arendt builds the beginning or the start of tradition by putting everything on Plato's trauma. This is very critical for me, okay? Not in the meaning of a canon, which is the technical or the epistemological question of the canon. So on the other hand, we have Marx. I'm wondering why Marx okay, let me go back once more and put this kind of question. Plato and Aristotle, we know that Plato and Aristotle are the two pillars, okay, of Western tradition. Both of them are systematic philosophers. Okay, and I'm wondering, Marx is a systematic philosopher? No. So it would be more logical for Arendt to put not Marx, but Kant and Hegel, because both of them are systematic philosophers. So we have the traditional pillar of philosophy, which is Plato, or the beginning, okay, Plato and Aristotle, and then at the end, we have Kant and Hegel. So why Arendt builds the canon of Western, okay, philosophy in this way, in that sense? It concerns vita activa and vita contemplativa, or it has an epistemological meaning that I can't see very well, so very clear. So this is the question for me. Roger, I would like to know your opinion on this question. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Spiros. I mean, the easy answer, and maybe too easy and too trite, is that she's not talking about the history of philosophy. She's talking about the history of political philosophy and the tradition of political philosophy. And while Hegel and Kant have a political philosophy within them, they're not really political philosophers so much as they are philosophers. And their politics is not so influential in the way that Marx is. But you know, I think she's, to the extent they have a political philosophy, I think she sees it as part of the tradition. It's at least Hegel, in the sense that it's anti-political. You know, Kant, it's more complicated for Arendt, because there are ways in which she tries to read Kant to make him more political, in her sense. But so one answer is, she's talking about political philosophy, and Marx is the attempt to, as she says, stand Hegel on his head, and she sees Marx as the great political thinker of the modern era, right? I mean, if you read Marx, and you read Marx the way Arendt reads him, and I don't think only Arendt, I mean, this is not, I think, exclusive to Arendt, we are still living in a Marxist political world. We're still living in a world of the attempt to have the state wither away and replace politics with a kind of welfare administrated state. And if that's how we understand 20th and now 21st century politics, it's still very much in the Marxian mold. And Arendt's insight into that is to say that the entire sense of politics in the post-Marxist era has been soundly within the tradition of political thought in its contempt for politics and contempt for opinion and difference. And it's the attempt, whether it's the 5-year plan of Stalin or whether it's, you know, the sort of presidential commissions of Kennedy and up through Barack Obama and whatever, it's an attempt to create administered expert rule that doesn't pay attention to what people believe and want, but seeks to impose a kind of truth on politics. You know, I think so. I mean, part of it is a judgment of hers that if you want to understand politics today in its anti-political sense, Marx is the right person to look to. Not Kant, right? And Hegel, yeah, you could look to Hegel, but you know, but Hegel's politics is hard to find, and Marx is a much better way to do it. So go ahead, Spiros.
Sorry for interrupting you, but in that sense, it could be Nietzsche, for example.
Say that again?
In that sense, it could be Nietzsche, for example. So what is the criterion? The criterion is the philosophy itself or the influence of a philosopher on politics? This is the critical question for me, because Nietzsche, for example, it's too critical, too influential, okay, in the contemporary philosophy. Why not Nietzsche in that sense?
Well, I mean,
because Marx, as you said, okay, if I understood it very well, because Marx influences, okay, the modern world, the contemporary world, especially the 20th century, in a very strong way. It concerns Marxian thought, concerns politics, okay, and society and the revolutions and so on. So the criterion, okay, is the way a philosopher influences the political action within the world. So it is not a philosophical question, a technical one, an epistemological one. It's a political question itself. And this is my question because I teach philosophy. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I would like to know how we build the canon. Okay, which for us, it's a technical or epistemological question, not a political one.
Well, I mean,
maybe
I think
for me as a philosopher, okay, Nietzsche is more influential than Marx, Roger.
Yeah, but that's
the right question.
That's because Nietzsche's a philosopher, Spiros. Marx,
yes, I see. Yes.
But Marx is not.
This is what I'm saying, Roger. This is what I'm saying. Yes, I agree with you 100%. So the criterion, okay, the critical question is not the philosophical one, but the political one. So Marx is not a philosopher. He's a political actor, okay, broadly.
Well, no, he's not he's a political thinker.
Okay.
Well, let me just say, Nietzsche is a great philosopher. I love Nietzsche, and I agree with you. Nietzsche.
For example, Nietzsche, for example, okay, maybe John Stuart Mill.
Okay, but Spiros, let me
to Marx in London.
Let me answer you, okay? How much of Nietzsche is about the state? There's some, but it's not the core of Nietzsche. You can find political philosophy in Nietzsche, but it's not the core. Same with Kant, Hegel, and Leibniz, etc. So part of it's, that Marx is writing about politics, and he's specifically trying to write about changing politics. But part of it is that Marx has given us the theory of the state and the withering away of the state into administration that matters today. And I think, you can find pushes towards that in Nietzsche and Hegel and others. But I just, I think if you want to write about the philosopher or the thinker or whatever you want to call him, who has impacted our political world today, it's hard to, I find Nietzsche much more interesting than Marx, but Marx is, I think, certainly more politically influential and politically impactful than Nietzsche today. Nietzsche is great at understanding certain things, but Marx is great at, inspiring things and inspiring politics. And it's particularly the politics of getting rid of politics, which is the one she's interested in. So part of it is just, this is her interest. Her interest is in who's actually opposed to politics, and Marx is in her reading.
So in the final analysis, Roger, the critical question is, what is politics?
Well, that's what
in order to build the canon, we need to know what is politics. Thanks a lot.
Well, Spiros, she says that in the beginning of the next essay, right? What is politics? Politics is based on the fact of human plurality, right? And then she says, because philosophy and theology are always concerned with man, they have found no valid philosophical answer to the question, what is politics? So philosophy doesn't actually care about politics, because whether you're Nietzsche or Kant or Hegel, you don't actually care about politics. You care about man. And then she says what politics is and then as a result, she says all great philosophers aren't great political thinkers, right? What is remarkable about all the great thinkers is that difference in rank between their political philosophies and the rest of their works. The politics never reaches the same depth. And then she says, what is politics? Politics deals with the coexistence and association of different men. Now, the people who deal with this are not Nietzsche and not Hegel. They're Hobbes and Locke. And they're not the great philosophers, but they are the political philosophers. And that's where Arendt is situating herself. And, you know, if you want to talk about the canon, what she's going to say is that to the extent you have people who talk about politics, as the coexistence and association of different men, they have been excluded from the canon. That's her argument. And she's trying to fight that, right, in a way, and by showing how the canon has over and again prejudicially excluded politics from what it means to do philosophy. That's her argument. And as a result, the canon has excluded freedom, at least as it's understood politically, from the canon of philosophy. It has a different definition of freedom as free will or some such, but she doesn't think that's what freedom is. And she thinks to the extent that we think of freedom that way, we think of it in a deracinated, philosophical, and anti-political way. I mean, that's a point that she makes very forcefully in the opening sections of her essay, What is Freedom? Where she really engages with the history of philosophy from Augustine and others, and says that they just completely misunderstand what freedom is, because they treat it philosophically as a capacity of man, and not politically as a capacity of men acting together. And so that's why I think she turns to Marx, because Marx is, Marx also rejects freedom, but he rejects freedom not based in a philosophical prejudice that we talk about man, but he rejects freedom because of his embrace of history as a political force instead of action as a political force. And that is, to her, the huge transformative change that Marx recognizes already in Hegel and introduces into politics.
Okay, Roger.
Is that at least a decent disagreement between us?
Okay, yes, thanks a lot.
Roger, it's Sam. I just want to add something to that, because Arendt does think of Marx as a thinker of freedom. And she's actually, if you look at her correspondence with Jaspers, they have a disagreement about whether or not it's freedom motivating Marx or justice. And this is ultimately why she turns to Marx within the canon. She says we can't blame Marx any more than Plato or Aristotle for the rise of fascism. But what Marx does is he breaks the tradition, which I think, Spiros, we can substitute with Canon here.
Yes.
She says what Marx does to break the tradition is that he elevates the anima laborans, the question of man as a laboring animal as the highest capacity of man, right, over man as animal rational, which had been the dominant idea since Plato and Aristotle. And that's why she's turning to Marx to see where that break in tradition is. But when she this was what became the human condition. And the first volume of the critical edition is the expanded lectures for this text, which are really worth looking at. But she says when she's writing this, she wants to save Marx in the sight of Karl Jaspers. She thinks he has good intentions in his thinking, but she has really substantive disagreements with him about how to create a free society. So, it's that elevation of labor, I think, which is really at stake here.
So Samantha, if I may here, please, could I say something? Samantha, I
Yes.
could buy your idea about this breaking of tradition, and this is my suggestion here, that Marx, according to Roger and Arendt, of course, Marx ends the tradition, but I think, and I agree with you 100% here, that Marx breaks the tradition. So it is different to say end the tradition and to say that Marx breaks the tradition. So we need here a different meaning of the word end. End in what sense? End as an end, as a terminus, okay, or as a new start, because Marx, as you said, breaks the tradition. In what sense? We know that Arendt rejects Marx that introduces the social, which is the opposite of the political. Okay, so he's not the end of tradition. He breaks the tradition, okay, by bringing to the fore something else. What is this else? Okay, this is the critical question here. According, in my opinion, it is the end of politics, which is the end of political. It's the end of the social, which is just the other side of political. And I agree with you. He breaks the tradition.
It's a break.
It's the right.
Yeah, if you want to talk about,
interpretation, sorry.
Yeah, no, in terms of end though, I think this is where freedom becomes important, because the question of, how we achieve freedom within the society of plurality that Arendt imagines is through speech and action. And that's precisely what Karl Marx strips from his understanding of social and political life, right? Man is no longer animal rationale, achieving distinction and equality through speech and action, but through his animal capacity to labor is how he comes to consciousness. It's absolutely a break. And I think, then that's where Arendt, draws us into, her own way of political thinking. She was liberated by the break in tradition to think the tradition anew. Her question isn't how to save freedom or return to a Greek polis. It's how can we, confronting our newest political experiences, understand freedom as it's evolved over time. And she, as we see here, feels free to leap over the centuries and to draw on the tradition in the way that she wants to, in order to understand the contemporary phenomena of totalitarianism and what's happening to freedom in society as she's writing.
Thanks a lot.
But if I can just say, but from the context of just this article, I believe the answer to the question of what the end of tradition means is really just that last statement that she put in her paragraph, which, if I may read, the consequence that Marx drew from Hegel's philosophy of history was the action or praxis, contrary to the whole tradition, was so far from being opposite of thought that it was the true and real vehicle of thought, and that politics was far from being infinitely beneath the dignity of philosophy, was the only activity that was inherently philosophical. So she has pretty much upended and put the whole thing where the philosophy being superior to politics, it's really politics that is the source of all philosophy, which is an upending of the tradition.
For example, this is exactly what Castoriadis says about this kind of analysis, that politics, okay, nurtures philosophy, not the other way around.
Politics nurture philosophy.
Okay. Listen, this was... Hello? Clara, did you want to say something?
I would like to add that in the beginning of the book, Between the Past and Future, I remember that Hannah Arendt writes, the traditional political philosophy starts with Plato in the Republic and finishes with Marx. Why with Marx? She says, because Marx is the first one that says, against the traditional thought, the philosophical political thought, he says, sorry, I'm trying to translate it. Philosophy and truth doesn't appear outside human affairs. Human affairs, that's what, let me say. Marx states that philosophy and truth, they doesn't appear, outside human affairs, but within human affairs. And that's the reason why she says that Marx is states the end, and she says, again, she uses the word end as a final, the end of the tradition. That is the justification that she encounters, and she states in the introduction of In Between Past and Future. Why? Because for Plato, human affairs are changeable, human affairs are uncertain, human affairs are temporal, involves conflict, and all sort of that. So against Plato, Marx and Arendt, they are going to say, sorry, but human affairs are the important thing in terms of political issues. Why? And I want to finish, because if you guys, she will say, if you guys, philosophers, you are searching for the truth and the eternal, okay, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you look if you're in the search of freedom, and I would say in the search of the experience of freedom, you have to go through the human affairs. That's the point. Say something, guys.
Okay, no, look, this has been great. I think this was a good, I hope a good way to end, if that's okay. Does anyone need to say anything more? Because I think a lot has come out. You know, the break, the end of affairs that Clara is talking about, and Spiro and Sam, you know, is the Nietzschean, right, inversion of truth from an ideal into a thing of this world, and yet it's still part of the tradition because it seeks to denigrate politics, now not in the name of some higher truth, but in the name of some human truth. At least that's how I understand it. But yeah, go ahead.
Can I slide in a very quick one here?
Yeah.
My question is only about what she means after she says politics arises in what lies between men, and then adds that it's a matter of relationships. How would she characterize those relationships? Are they essentially the phenomenon of people speaking and conversing in the public square? Are they negotiations, transactions? It seems a bit, if that's all it is, it's pretty much a cool temperature kind of thing. There doesn't seem to be much human warmth in it, but maybe I'm reading it too carefully or too unsympathetically.
I believe relationships here, maybe Sam or someone remind me, the word I think she's trying to translate is from Montesquieu. What is the word, the French word that that Montesquieu uses to speak about the relationships and bonds between people?
Whatever.
I'm blanking on that word, Stephen. I'm gonna have to get back to you on it, but I take it to mean that politics arises in what lies between men and is established in relationships is sort of the principles and connections and laws and norms that hold us together, that bond a multitude into a unity of some sort, that makes us have a common world amongst our differences. That's what I take to be what she's saying here, although I don't have a strong sense of relationship as a technical term. If anyone else wants to add to that, they can.
I cannot. I will add.
Yeah.
Remember, I was just thinking that, but I don't remember the place. But Arendt says that actually the world is a fabric of meanings and relationships.
Yeah.
And I think her metaphor, it's well said, yeah, metaphor, is a really, how you say, lovely one, because she says that, and I remember the metaphor that you were using once, Roger, with the table around the people. You remember that metaphor that you, okay. So I would say that for Hannah Arendt, the space between us, which is the world, is made up with relationships. If there were no space, if there were no tables, if there were no meanings, no interaction, there will be just one on top of the other. And it's very meaningful because it says that we need a space to express our ideas, to differentiate it between us, to actually express what is unique in each individual, and to actually make real plurality, which is the basic condition for politics.
Thanks, Clara. Okay, I'll look up what I can, the word from Montesquieu that I'm blanking. It's like rallier or something like that. I'm blanking on it.
I'll try to do the same.
And thank you all. We're going to be reading for next week, continuing on with Introduction to Politics, reading from page 96 to 114. So up to the section, the meaning of politics, but not that yet. So what is the meaning of politics is the last section we're reading. It's about 20 pages. So we'll read that for next week, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks very much.